for being so open and frank. So,
I just want to comment that you actually admitted using a private health service without any sense of shame, and that's what's got us where we are. The point about it in Ireland is that we have allowed our public services to be run down by people opting out of our publicly funded education system, our publicly funded health service. Once people opt out to any large degree, the political momentum for change is not there. Now, it's cheating in this sense that it's cheating on the individuals themselves, because next year or the year after they may not be able to afford private services. It's also cheating on their fellow citizens or their fellow inhabitants of the country, because the political clout to improve the situation is removed, governments can ignore it. Now, until we take both education and healthcare totally out of party politics and take their funding out of the present taxation, and go for a hypothecated contribution from everybody into a fund drawn on by everybody, and likewise for education. When people are complaining about wages in the north being lower and us being not competitive, whether with the north or with other parts of Europe, they never point out that Irish people in general have far more outgoings for services that in other countries are funded collectively. And the wealthier people are, the more duty they have to use the public services, because they've paid more for them if you look at the taxation system and if people have paid their level of tax. So in some countries I've had experience of people who are very wealthy and making sure they got their value and therefore putting pressure on the public services. And until Irish people see the public services as their possession to be minded well and judiciously, because they may need to use them, and if they don't need to use them, at least they know their money is going to support other people. So as a supporter of a hypothecated contribution for education, people without children shouldn't be worried about paying it, because they know it'll be going to their neighbours' children or their siblings' children or somebody that they're going to work with in the future. So it is possible to have a country with nil illness, everybody well educated, and a clean, safe environment. And I don't want anyone to be commenting that somebody of 82 has lived a long life. That is not a long life by European standards. It is for Irish males, or 87 for Irish males, and I've had 2 instances recently people made those kind of comments. Until we have less an acceptance of illness and less an acceptance of early death, we won't get anywhere. It is possible to do this, but we have to see that the public services are ours to be minded, and that cheating by opting out is at least socially unacceptable behaviour.
Okay, could I ask you just while Emily gathers her thoughts on that, why do you think, or do you have a view on why people, as you say, cheat, but decide to go to an alternative rather than the public sector service?
Well, I don't know personally, but one of the reasons I see is because it is socially acceptable. In countries where it's not socially acceptable, people don't do it. If people see their services as theirs, they've paid for them. Everybody has paid for their services and see it as their possession and nurture it. Now, the problem is if people don't use their public services, don't use their public education system, don't use the public health service. I'm not saying it has to be run as a public service. You can also have the funding as collective funding with private providers. I have no problem with that, as long as those private providers are totally open equally to everybody.
Okay, I've got the point, right. Thank you very much for that.
I accept what you're saying. I'd quibble with the use of the word cheating. The users of the service don't create the services, don't devise the services, don't have political power over the services. And I think if you're in a situation where you have a relative, or say a child or an elderly parent, and you're given 2 choices, and you know, rightly or wrongly, that one is going to lead to a better outcome for that, ideology can go out the window in those cases. That's my view.
Good evening. My name is Michael Ewing. I'm the coordinator of the Environmental Pillar of Social Partnership. And I'd like to thank Emily both for this evening and for her general good work. One of the roles that you have is as Commissioner for Environmental Information, a new office since 2007, and one which most people haven't a clue it exists. I'd like you to comment upon that, and also in terms of the restrictions within the regulations, in terms of your role, the fees that have to be paid for people using the service, and just a general comment about that.
Okay.
But also, sorry, but just briefly, you mentioned also a narrative that's been going on for some time. We're still getting a very strong narrative, which seems to be common to all the media, that there is only one way out of this hole that we're in, and that is a hole that we've dug, and the only way out of that is actually to cut everything, to cut services left, right and centre. And that's one particular role, one particular way out, one particular narrative, but we're not getting many other narratives from the media.
Okay.
I agree that there are it's very few people know about it. I mean, it's not, strictly speaking, my role to advertise it. I would see that as the role of the parent department.
Which is, by the way, Department of the Environment.
Yeah, yeah. And I have myself done my best to spread the word within the media. I have invited, individual members of the media to meet me and to meet my officials, and to tell them about this and to invite them to use it, which is slightly outside my brief. I mean, I'm there as an appeals person. But as a result of that, I have noticed that a few more stories around the environmental information is coming out. People do get it confused with FOI. They don't realise that there are many more bodies potentially whose records are potentially accessible under the environmental legislation than there is under FOI. There's quite a high-profile case that was appealed by the Taoiseach's department to the High Court in relation to a cabinet record that I ordered to be released. I lost in the High Court in relation to that, and I'm now considering an appeal to the Supreme Court. But there hasn't been any advertising campaign. It's probably a pretty well-kept secret within the. I hope over time it will be used, but there haven't been any. I think sometimes what prompts interest in this is when there is a particularly high-profile case or a particularly interesting piece of information comes out. A lot of the appeals I've dealt with are to do with procedural issues, whether certain bodies, can be deemed to be public bodies for the purposes of the regulations, whether certain bodies hold certain records and so on. So it's a bit of a slow burn, but I have been, trying to evangelise, if you like, in relation to it.
And what about the second point Michael made about the one narrative around how we deal with the problem that we're now facing, where it's all about?
You see, the thing is, I don't think anybody knows, and I suppose the narrative, the government leads and obviously has a very powerful voice. It has that. I mean, I think people, whether they trust or not, they do want to trust. Certainly there seem to be a lot of outside voices saying yes. I mean, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I mean, I suspect, I don't know this, the government was faced with, a number of options, and they just, for whatever, decided to go with that one and maybe cross their fingers when they were doing it. I mean, but a dominant narrative does tend to take hold, all right, as it did in the boom years and has it done now.
Is that function of the way media behave, or is it a function of the way that people are waiting for what's dished out to them rather than to investigate, to go further, to try and look at
funny
things
enough, I think there may be a bit more questioning now, because I think the opening up of the media and new media and all of that. I mean, I log on quite a lot to politics.ie, as a source of an information source, and very often they break stories faster than the traditional media. And you also get such a diverse range of voices. It's extraordinary. You pick up even, newspapers that do, say, let's say the Irish Times, which does have diverse voices, but like it might have 3 different voices. You'd go to politics and you've 100 different views.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that does trickle out. I think that does stimulate the debate, and even the use of Twitter and the famous Dan Boyle thing as well. I think things are being shaken up, and I think as well, if people feel that they were fooled either by their own naivety or by the naivety of people in charge, then I think critical senses will come into play more.
Thank you very much. My name is Mannix Flynn. I'm a Dublin City Councillor, and thank you very much for the talk tonight. And hello. I'd like to praise the FOI Act in that it's probably the most single act in the history of the state that gives a bit of power to the individual in terms of obtaining some information on themselves and the things around them. So we need to see more of that, and we need to see every citizen being made aware of that. I also think we need, to have a very strong advocacy in relation to the promotion of the Freedom of Information Act and the office of the Ombudsperson person. I think it's vitally important, and I think there's a vast amount of our citizens who are completely unaware that they can obtain information. As a Dublin City Councillor, 90% of those who get public housing have no idea that they can get their files off the Dublin City Council because they don't readily promote that. And it's one way of engaging with people, because people need to be engaged with it. In relation to the consequences for the former chairman of the Anglo-Irish Bank, it's important to note that most of the boards of those banks who created the situation in banking are still involved in banking. They're still there. There hasn't, by and large, been any consequences for those. The situation, I believe, that we're faced with at the moment is not just about banking, it's about the moral collapse and the shameless actions of not just the bankers, but the state, its agents, and the church, its agents and servants. It's a very shameful country that actually indemnifies acts of rape and torture in relation to the Ryan report. It's important to know that during the Murphy report, a number of bishops did resign. There was consequences for them, but no one resigned during the Ryan initiative or any of that subsequent inquiry. This kind of signal that gets sent out to the rest of Europe is pretty appalling. I suppose in terms of the economic collapse and the fear that people have in relation to what they're going to lose. Because 20 years ago, we didn't have an economy. We didn't have the jobs. We didn't really have these things. And now we've had them, and now we've lost them. And perhaps it's now time, as I say, to own our own poverty and to begin to use the mantra that hunger is a good sauce. As a representative in the first year for the South East area in Dublin City Council, I must say, that looking for my first year in office, you were all being hoodwinked by the whole single lot of them. They sit there and it's a complete quango. Labour, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, they're all at the one thing. They don't have any regard whatsoever for the individual member of the public. And Dublin City Council is simply another massive corporation who's indifferent to the people of Dublin. But as I say, the only way that we can empower ourselves is to use the Act to make sure that the Garda Síochána comply with it. And I'd like to see the Act extended into the church and all the records that they hold, particularly in relation to the records of the Magdalene laundries and the people in the Magdalene laundries. They're both historical records and they are very important records, and the church and the state were hand in glove, so they should come in under the Act. We should follow suit in relation to the way the UK has had their Act. I would also ask if Emily would comment on the proposals for a whistleblowers charter, which is now being called for, and perhaps we could have one along the lines of the Public Disclosure Act. Thank you very much.
People felt freer to talk about what was going on, be it the banks or any of the other institutions that were at fault in relation to this. Perhaps, a lot of what happened might have been halted in its tracks to whatever degree, and clearly, obviously that hasn't happened yet, and there's a reluctance there. I mean, I think you're right about accountability and people being able to access, the truth about what happened in our institution in the past, be it in the church, the Magdalene laundries, and all of that, because sometimes we forget what this republic is supposed to be about. It is supposed to be about power coming from us, the people. And I think sometimes we perhaps cede too much power, and we perhaps collude ourselves in an overly sort of paternalistic view of what's good for us. I remember Mannix mentioned the guards there, and I've called for many years, and my predecessor did as well, for the guards to be included under FOI. And I remember some time ago speaking to a senior guard and talking about this, and he said, I was making the point that, the guards or the police in the UK are under the Act and, nothing's happened, no harm's been done, exactly. And he said, he said, no, we trust you, he said, it's just who might come after you that we mightn't trust. And I said, yeah, but I mean, even if I have a rush of blood to the head in order the release of, incredibly sensitive files, there is the High Court and the Supreme Court who are there to stop me. But again, I think it's this, not letting anybody see your homework, not taking the risk, and also other people, who think they know best, controlling the information.
Well, there's a quote from that speech you made, which I was quite taken with, where you said, we need to see, to stop seeing institutions, whether it's the guards or the church or whatever, as other than to us, because I think it picks up your point, the lady made earlier on.
I mean, I was listening, there was an interview with Michael Viney, the Irish Times journalist, and Mannix will be aware of this, and other people, that he did a series in the Irish Times around 1966, and he went around a lot of the, Dangan and Letterfrack and the various institutions, and talked to boys there, and they told him not about the sexual abuse, but the hunger, the cold, the beatings, kids running away, being brought back and beaten again. Laid it all out in a series in the Irish Times, and according to Michael Viney, he said he thought there was one letter. So when I made a speech, I'd been invited to. There was an anniversary conference of the Sisters of Charity, and I'd been asked to do that and agreed to do it before the Ryan report came out. And when the Ryan report came out, I thought, well, I can't just pitch up and not talk about this. And so I talked about this thing. I talked about the reaction of the Irish people, of us, to the atrocities in the Ryan report, and I said we were a bit like American soldiers stumbling into Belsen in the wake of World War II in the concentration camps, and thinking, my God, who could have done this? What monsters did this? We didn't know that this was happening. And yet, during all of that period, people knew what was happening. The Institute, well, maybe Letterfrack was in the back of beyond, but there were other places on the Magdalen Lawn. They were right slap bang in the middle of the community. And, the judges knew about it, solicitors knew about this, teachers knew about it, the plain people knew about this, but there was an acceptance of it, there was a tolerance of it. We move on, our culture shifts for whatever reason, and we look back with horror and thought, how could people have done that? But the people were us only a few decades earlier. I mean, it's like we look back on the excesses of the boom years and the madness. And as I said, when you look back in the paper, all of this was kind of accepted. And now we look back on it and thought, God, how could they have done that? And there's no escaping it now, because then was only 18 months ago.
Exactly, and we were participants.
We were participants. Obviously, governments and senior civil servants and people who do run the country have huge role and a huge responsibility, but it's, we the people elect, appoint.
Yeah. And of course, if we're going to shift culture, we have to take responsibility. There's nobody else can do that for us. Thank you very much, Max. Now, the gentleman over this side who is...
Tom O'Connor, I teach in DIT. Is there a case for political media pundits to be subject to FOI? And what strikes me is that there's a current article in the Le Monde Diplomatique about media pundits in the United States coming on very rapidly about oil or criticising Obama's green policies, commenting on Afghanistan and so on and so forth, but not exactly owning up to the fact that they're in the pay of military suppliers or the oil industry or nuclear power industry or whatever.
Okay, so what you mean is where commentators appear in the media and look like they're independent, but in actual fact there's another agenda behind that, or a paymaster.
And I think we should know if there is.
Okay, that's a fair point. And
I think so. Well, I think in the better, shall we say, media in the US, the big old nationals, or not nationals, the Washington Post and New York Times, I mean, I think their own particular code of ethics would not allow those, well, we would hope, those conflicts of interest. I'm not sure how you could actually apply FOI to it. I mean, FOI typically is for public bodies. Obviously, if there is a conflict, we should know about it, but I just can't see how FOI could...
The point you're making, I appreciate. I think maybe it's down to the media owners as against society, but I think you take your point. Now,
yeah, good evening, Pat Clark from Down Syndrome Ireland, and thank you both for an informative evening. And Emily, I've referred a few people to your office in the last while, but I don't think it'll drastically increase the workload as a result of some of the stuff that I'm going to mention. You did mention in your talk about designing services around the individual as a priority, but increasingly I've become aware of decisions that warrant your "oh, for God's sake" moment are being made by people who have no concept of the impact that these decisions have on people with intellectual disability and people with Down syndrome in particular, and for people with disabilities in general, because they have no personal experience in the area. And again, to quote yourself, they need to get real people in their sites. It's more a comment maybe than a question, but I think it's worth thinking about. Okay. Thank you.
thank you for that.
The recent debate and controversy around respite care, is very pertinent to what I was saying about that we need to assert what our public values are. I mean, I know the market has been supreme over the last while, and I think the market obviously in this country will continue to have a significant role, but I think we need to know what are the things that the state is not going to leave to chance. Yeah. That is not going to allow the whim of the marketplace to dictate.
Like our children and our people who've got the disability and the disadvantage.
People who are vulnerable.
Yes, exactly. Okay.
Thanks. I'm Stephen. I was telling my friend I'm a recovering academic. I went back as a mature student and I studied public advocacy, But what I've come across during the time of dealing with, when you're in education, you're dealing with a lot of different systems, And in that experience, I've come across a lot of, obstacles to progress. So what I wanted to ask was, would Emily, when you see somebody coming to your office, when we talk about language, are they complainants? Because I'd like to see those people seen as an asset, because they can actually help devise systems that actually are the users of the system can help contribute to devising better systems, more efficient systems as well, you know. So
no, it's a very good point. One of the best ways to learn about how to operate your business is to listen to your complaints, and you have a listening post to help design things better.
No, you're right. Obviously, when people come to my office, they are complaining about a particular thing. But one of the things we talk to the public bodies about, and the good ones get it and the bad ones don't, is that, complainants and complaints are an asset, because they teach you the fault lines in your business and how to improve them. And I mean, there are occasions when we've been through this with the public body and they've invited us back to see how the improvements have been made. But advocacy is huge, and it is particularly huge in the health system. And yesterday I met with a HSE official in relation to pushing through an advocacy project, because especially in the hospital system and in nursing homes as well, people are vulnerable by definition, and very often they don't want to complain. And if you have, a formal advocacy system independent of the public body, I mean, that is going to help immeasurably in relation to people's access to services and to having their complaints dealt with as well. And it's certainly a priority. And
just as an add-on to that, there's the dealing with the specific issue when it arises, or complaint, and then does the office try and drive through a change as a result of that as part of your work?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we do check and see that the recommendations have been implemented and so on. Yeah. And very often let's say we see something that's gone wrong within the local authority, we will write out to and we suspect that this is systemic. Then we'll contact every other local authority and ask them to check. Nice. Yeah, or equally with a HSE area, if something's gone wrong there. And very often we do find that there is a systemic problem and we fix it.
And can you impose that on people? Can you force it?
Well, I only make recommendations, but they are implemented in virtually 100% of cases.
Okay, all right, that's good to hear. Now,
Thanks. My name's Desmond O'Toole. I'm a member of the Labour Party and also of the Party of European Socialists. You've been 7 years in the office, which is almost a presidential term, Emily. And I'm wondering, part of your role, a significant part of your role is obviously adjudicating on individual applications that are made here, but then there's a broader systemic role, and it's looking at the patterns of failure by the public service in this country. And if we take a look at the public service at the moment, it's still pretty poor in terms of inequalities, in terms of secrecy, in terms of incompetence even, it's not typical of the civil service, but it's endemic. It's part of the culture of the organisation. Where do you think you've fallen down during those 7 years, if that is still the vista of the public services that we're surveying at the moment?
Okay.
Where have I fallen down?
I think it's where have you fallen down whereby there hasn't been change made in the system where the system could have improved.
Yeah, well, I suppose we're complaint driven, you know, so the complaints we get are the ones that we attempt to fix, and if we don't get them, you know, we can't fix them. And sometimes the solution to the problem is not me making a recommendation, but actually a policy change, and that's not my territory, you know. So I have to be, you know, very careful around that particular area, but I will keep at it. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I did an investigation report a couple of years ago in relation to waste waivers. In other words, people who don't have much money, need to have their bins collected, can't afford the charge. And I discovered that there was sort of increasing privatisation of waste disposal. And when this happened, people were either unable to pay for their waste disposal, wasn't being done, whatever. And in the report, I made a very strong point that simply by ceding the service to a private operator, the local authority could not cede its social obligation in relation to, you know, making sure that people of limited means get their waste collected and so on. And so over the last few years, I have been engaged with the Department of the Environment in relation to this issue and making sure that they very much keep that to the forefront of their thinking when they're talking about resource allocation and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I mean, I play an advocacy role, but my office is still just one player in all of it. We do try as much as we can and as much as we are capable of to keep the public interest at the centre of all that we do and not to look in on ourselves. And I've said before that I think a lot of the time when public bodies start to go bad, you know, FOSS for a period, for example, it's when they started looking at their own interest rather than at the public interest. My office is not perfect. We're sometimes very slow in terms of what we do. We don't turn things around fast enough. But I do think that we do affect very good and positive outcomes for individuals, and that we have brought around some systemic changes in quite a lot of areas. I mean, you have to be careful as well about how you use your influence and how far you go, because there can be diminishing returns. You know, if I go up to the mountaintop and screech, and people might listen to me today, if I keep on doing it, they'll say, well, there she goes again. So you have to be judicious in terms of the issues that you focus on and the change that you try and affect, and that you try and influence around that. And you do that not just by getting, hopefully, the trust of individual complainants, but also the trust of the public bodies, so that they know that you're not just up for the complainant, that you're looking at things independently and impartially. I mean, when we were setting out our strategic plan for the next 3 years, I mean, one of the things I very much want to do is, you know, a key thing is in the area of health, but another key thing is just for the office to have, because we do have that wider particular view of the public administration, to have more impact at policy level, so that the experience that my office gets from dealing with complaints can have an impact further up the line. But I don't do policy. No.
Okay, thank you very much. Very comprehensive. Now,
Could I ask you, please, is there a rule or regulation regarding if I write to an individual in a public body, I've heard that the standard is 5 working days that they would acknowledge or write back to the person. I have come across lately that hasn't happened in a case that what's happened is the person twice has publicly admitted that he doesn't write back. So I wonder, well, eventually he did, but he doesn't write back. I'm wondering, like, I'm sure he would write back to John Gormley. But
yeah. Well, lots of public bodies have their customer charters in which they make commitments in relation to it. However, if you want to contact my office, if it is a public body that you're talking about, we'd certainly look into it for you and see what should have happened in your case.
I just want to thank you for what you've done, and I want to particularly thank Ms. O'Reilly. She's been a shining light in this country. I've come to the conclusion, after taking interest in politics and social affairs all my life, which has been a fairly long one, there is a passion for secrecy in this country, and a passion to such an extent that family secrets are kept for far too long amongst far too few, and that being in the know is a great privilege, which is one of the reasons why everything stays inside the semi-mythical but possibly far too real golden circle. It's the secrecy bit. Don't publish your report, make it as difficult to get hold of it as possible, make it as long as possible, so that even if it is on the internet, you're cross-eyed. And the other thing is the cult of what my father used to call the decent skin. He might have won it on the horses. Maybe his wife threw him out. Anything you care to think of in current public life, an excuse is made. And the whole thing is crowned then by a new passion we have. Incomprehensible, loose, rubbery, melting language. I don't see why people in public office can get away with saying and writing demonstrably, obviously, meaningless rubbish in either the first or the second national language. And I'm tired of being patronized under those 3 headings. Thank you for what you've both done, but particularly for what Emily O'Reilly has done in the past 7 years, and I hope for many years to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In fact, thank you for that contribution.
Well, yeah, breaking down the barriers of I don't know where we inherited the culture of secrecy. Maybe it was from, the foundation of the state and the wars that went on that and so on and so forth, and our political history. But, you're right, and I've spoken earlier this evening about the kind of paternalistic sense, we know best, you're not entitled to this. I do think the FOI Act has broken that down a little bit. And even though they rode the Act back in 2003, I think what had changed was some of the culture within the public, that there was a greater expectation among the public that stuff would be released, whether within FOI or outside of FOI. And that people have to make a much stronger case nowadays for
exactly.
keeping
So it's a
things
stronger case not to give the information rather than a case to
exactly.
do it. Okay, we'll take 1 or 2 more questions.
My name is Mary Mason, and I belong to the Older Women's Network of Ireland. We're, amongst other things, a lobbying organisation to see that older women get their dues, which we probably do. But I would like to ask the Ombudsman if she would make a comment on the disgraceful and sinister situation where the director of the ESRI admitted that the figures and projections that they produced over 2 years were way out because of the lack of information that they got from the banks. Now, if the ESRI is let stumble around in the dark, what hope is there for anybody else? And as far as FOI is concerned, if it's not lowering the tone of the meeting, a young plumber in my house at the day that it was the Act was passed said FO Ireland, and he gave it its full intent. he says, that's what it is, FO Ireland, F off Ireland. And I suspect that we are being duped. And I don't mean to denigrate the role of the Ombudsman, but I suspect that certain departments in the public service allow complaints to drift off after they'll take it to the Ombudsman. And I would like to know if the Ombudsman would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's possible in some cases, but I think because public bodies that transgress are named in the annual report, and details of what they've done wrong are written down. I don't like to use the expression name and shame, but it's a form of that.
Yeah.
I don't think public bodies particularly like appearing in the annual report. If they have any self-respect in any event, you know, I mean, if you're running an organisation, you don't want to see it in lights in my report in relation to that. So what was the other?
Well, I think
the SRI.
The SRI director. Yeah.
Well, I made the point. I mean, I was just listening, as I said, to the minister, Battle-Keefe himself, saying that effectively he didn't trust the banks to give him the information, and that's. I think you used the expression scary.
But it is scary, it is. And I think if I can add to the wisdom of the lady up there with the nice shiny brooch, I think there's also a bit of protectionism goes on in our society, along with the secrecy that goes on. Okay, we'll take two more questions.
Brian Conagry from Atlantic Philanthropies. I'd like to ask a question just around something that we're seeing and we're hearing, and you see it in the press, and I think we've seen it just recently, is the trend towards settlement in cases. So people are going to the court in order to be able to access services and what they consider to be equality of opportunity in terms of education, and in certain examples, you know, other examples it might be underneath the asylum process and things like that. And what we're seeing is that in more and more cases, they are being settled out of court with the terms of that settlement not being made public. Actually, the condition of settlement is that they remain confidential. How does this actually help us, and how much is it hindering us in terms of improving services and the quality of access?
Okay, very good question.
Just, I know medical people talk about, let's say typically a child was injured at birth, let's say, or allegedly injured at birth, now cerebral palsy, whatever. And usually there is settlement without admission of liability. And I know there is a feeling within the wider medical community that this isn't helpful, that it would be more helpful if everything was known so that people can learn and so on and so forth. One of the issues that I've come across, and which I will be dealing with in a special report I'm doing on long-term care, nursing home care, is people's entitlement to nursing home care, all right? I'm not talking about the so-called Fair Deal scheme now, but we've had, you know, hundreds if not thousands of cases over the last several decades in which people who were entitled to public care in a nursing home, a public place in a nursing home, and there was nothing available, so they went into private care instead, sometimes on the promise that in the expectation that when the public place emerged that they'd get it. But years would go by and somebody would always be of greater need, so they'd be stuck there. Their families really stressed financially, everything, and never knowing what that individual's actual position was. And so much of the stress that is created is around the uncertainty. People don't know what their rights, what they're entitled to, what they can expect next year, 2 years. Is mum going to stay here? Is she going to go somewhere else? And so on and so forth. So anyway, when the whole brouhaha around nursing home, illegal nursing home charges blew up a few years ago, a lot of people started taking cases to the High Court against the HSE saying, hang on, I was entitled to a public place, but had to shell out tens, thousands in private. So we had a lot of these cases on our stocks, if you like, you know, in terms of how to deal with, you know, maladministration in relation to how people were dealt with in nursing homes. And we kept waiting and waiting and waiting for the High Court to make a decision, to make a judicial decision about it, to tell us what the law was and what it meant, and if necessary to be passed up to the Supreme Court. But they were all settled. No case has ever been actually heard. So people are still in legal, whatever, you know, limbo. We don't know, and I think that is, whether that's a deliberate strategy to avoid the fateful day when actually everybody's entitled to it, or
do you think that
not.
information like that settlement figures, particularly in areas of public interest.
Well, it's public money.
And regarding public money, ought to be made available. Yes.
Yeah, and for privacy, individual privacy, and so on and so forth. Also, in relation to the asylum and cases, I think I'm one of the few, if not the only, ombudsman in Western Europe, shall we say, or in the EU, who does not have asylum and naturalisation issues under my remit. Now, you see the chaos that is caused at the moment with people waiting years in the likes of Mosney and Bath Street and various places, waiting and the judicial reviews and so on and so forth, and their lives effectively on hold, and, you know, huge resources and money and so on going into this. And if my office were allowed to deal with at least some of those cases, you know, people would, it would obviously have a beneficial effect on the system, but the Department of Justice doesn't want to know. Again, it's control. It's, we'll decide, you won't.
You said earlier on there that when you, around the time you were offered the job, you said Freedom FOI was axed, and then you said later on that there was significant rollback in it, and then in the last instance there you talked about the Department of Justice. Could you give a list, or is it too long, of those areas where it was rolled back, why it was rolled back, and the effects of that?
Well, there were, whereas previously there was discretion in relation to the release of a particular record, mandatory exemptions came in, right? Now, I can't give you chapter and verse on every one, but there will be things like ministerial correspondence, minister to minister, for example, certain cabinet records, certain records in relation to international affairs. For example, let's say a multinational company was writing to an Irish embassy, you know, that they're completely out. Mainly around central government, the sort of the closer to the centre you got, the more the act was restricted. So basically, and I know because my colleagues at the time in the OIC would say to me that a lot of the rollbacks, you know, the new exemptions and so on that were brought in could actually be traced to particular decisions that had been made, you know, which had, you know, upset people or whatever. I mean, I can of course get you a full list, but it was around it was around cabinet decisions, it was around the real innards of policy making and so on. Whereas previously there may have been discretion in relation to release. Now there were mandatory exemptions. So even if I could see a public interest in in releasing stuff, I couldn't, because there was no public interest override. Once a record was established to be of a particular type, you know, that was it.
All right, listen, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Can I say a huge thank you on your behalf to Emily for her contribution?